I'm really excited about this class.
Good.
It's like we have everyone joining with us.
Good. I got to see a message on. Oh, okay. I had a message all of a sudden in the middle of my screen. I didn't know if I had to click it to keep on air or not, but it's just asked me if I want to unmute myself. But I obviously can be heard. So where's that?
All right. Well, Franz, I'm going to let you take it away. If anyone has any questions, just ask me questions in the chat box, and we'll get you your answers, and we'll talk with Franz.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here because I'm going to talk about something that I absolutely love doing, and that's illustrating. And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the progression from start to finish. And then I have a little project together that I thought it would be good for you to try to get a sense of how to do it. And we'll see how far we get with it. We may not have a finished piece of artwork, but I hope that at least you'll get some kind of idea about how the process goes. So the first thing I'm going to show, I brought my little portfolio stand here so I can show you. I illustrated several books for Leah Kamaiko. And she's a wonderful children's book writer, and she's now writing other things. But this is the book, and the page that I have to show for you is in the center of the book. And you kind of see the way it looks like. And so I think a lot of times, people really don't think about what it takes to get an illustration together. And so I'm hoping that I can show you a few basic steps and a progression of things to do that'll kind of help you along, whether you're doing a book or if you have some other illustration job, or even it's just to make kind of a cool thing to hang up. So in the progression of things, I can't talk enough about how important it is to work with sketches and your sketchbook. So this was a rough. Usually what happens is that you have the text to the book, and then you have a certain number of pages that you have to fill the book up with illustrations and allow for the actual writing, because it is a book. So even though your illustrations could be the best in the world, they're even better in companion with the words. So you do real fast sketches and start thinking about the layout. This isn't necessarily the exact proportion of the book, but I was just trying some ideas out. And essentially the book's about a woman that has a fabulous shoe shop and a shoe repair, and all her customers that come in. And so I got to make up the characters. In this case, I thought it'd be pretty funny for a horse and Frankenstein to come in, because this is something, how does she know whose shoes are whose? And I think it would be pretty obvious if Frankenstein came in with his shoes and a horse came in with their shoes. All right, so I do several of these real quick sketches. And this is just a marker on white paper. I usually work in a sketchbook, but since this was a little bit larger than the size I was normally working on, I wanted to work on bigger sheets of paper. So once I came up with a sketch that was pretty close to what I felt, and you can kind of see it's more like a view of the entire shoe shop, and the figures are full length. And as I developed my sketches, I came up with an alternative to that, because I thought it'd be more important to focus in on the characters and on the shoes in the background. And when I think about a shoe, it's more of a horizontal venue, unless you're doing a boot, and then that's more of a vertical. So I thought that I could get a lot more packed into the composition if I condensed it a bit and only had them kind of from the waist up at the counter. And that way I could call a lot more attention to the shoes and the detail and whatnot. So I had the sketched out, and I do a lot of drawing on tracing paper. And the reason I like tracing paper is it's easy to erase, and you can also take other pieces of tracing paper and try different things. I thought, well, what do I want up here in this shelf, or what do I want over here? So if I sketch things out on a piece of tracing paper, I could put it down and I could move it around. And so I do a lot of the work on the tracing paper the very first thing. Now, once I got the entire composition completed, it's to scale. I've shown where the bleeds are and the center line. So this is exactly the size of the book. So then I got to get this onto a better piece of paper, because it's a little bit difficult to do finished artwork on tracing paper. So what I end up doing is taking another piece of tracing paper, and you can see how shiny it is. And I'll use a graphite crayon. And in a minute, I'll find where that is. I don't want to stop right now. But this is full of graphite. And what you end up doing is flipping it over, put it underneath your drawing, and it works like a carbon paper. Now, you don't want to use carbon paper to transfer an image because it's very greasy and it's very hard to erase. The graphite is the same stuff that's in your pencil, and so that you can get it to transfer very nicely to your better piece of paper. So here's the same drawing then, and it's just a matter of putting the slip of the graphite paper between the tracing and the better paper, and I was able to get a nice line drawing of the entire situation. So now it's really looking much more finished, and you can see a lot more of what's going on. Now my style of illustration involves a really solid black ink line around most of the characters and the objects, and then I use a variety of materials, color pencil, watercolor, gouache, things like that to color it in. So once I get the graphite all worked out, then I will ink it out. So the ink goes right over the pencil, and then when the pencil dries, when the ink dries, then I'm able to go back with a kneaded eraser and pick up all the graphite marks. Now it's just a matter of coloring it. And so in this case, I used watercolor. And so then this is the last step. So we've gone from doing sketches with markers in a sketchbook, and I really do quite a bit of sketching. And I don't always go with my first ideas, evidenced by, let's go back to that one. So you can see that the composition has changed a bit from my first idea. It was just a way to kind of, you just test the waters, and then you start think about it, you do some more sketching, and eventually I came up with a composition and a drawing that I felt was a lot stronger than the original. Okay, so I've got another series that I wanted to show you quickly. And this time we don't need this. And I'm going to bring a little guy in here. This is my friend Hippopotamus. There we go. Okay, I'm a big fan of the poet Ogden Nash, and he was a poet that was kind of mid-century, maybe even earlier than that, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, but he was a very humorous poet. And I read one of his poems that I wanted to illustrate, and I'll read it to you. Behold the hippopotamus, we laugh at how he looks at us. And yet in moments dark and grim, I wonder how we look to him. Peace, peace, thou hippopotamus, we really look all right to us, as you no doubt delight the eye of other hippopotami. So that's the text, that's the poem. And so I thought, okay, well, let's do an illustration. So the first thing I do is I'll go out and, I guess that's the best orientation for now. I went to the zoo, and I, had a general notion of what a hippopotamus looks like and everything, but I really didn't know, how many toenails do they have, or is there anything about them, and how are they put together? So I will take my sketchbook with me, and I'll sketch, and I'll sketch, and I'll sketch, and they have some, degree of reality to them. A lot of it also is the shading and the way that I try to get all the parts together and whatnot. And then as soon as I'm done with these, I usually just tear them out and throw them out, because I now want to go and think about drawing the animal from my imagination, but that is based on all this research. Now, just a little aside about sketchbooks, what I find is that I take my sketchbook everywhere, and I take pens, I take pencils, whatever. So I'm never that worried about waiting. If I go to the dentist, if I go to the doctor, if I'm on a train, if I'm at the airport, if things are delayed, I have something to do, because I'd love to work in the sketchbook. And I brought a couple here just to show you an idea of how that can work too. There we go. Okay. So a lot of times what will happen is I'll have a lot of line work that looks a little bit more, I've got sheets of this too, not only on sketchbooks, but also just on pieces of paper and stuff. I'll work on it and I'll get a whole page filled with all these ink drawings. And then the one or two of them that I really like, I'll go back with watercolor or pencil or something like that and test things out. So I'm always working on ideas. Just a couple more samples. This is a couple lines I made, and then my imagination kind of took over and I started coiling snakes hanging off of it. And then I had a project where I was working with raccoons, so I started working on my raccoons. This one was a sketchbook I was doing kind of when I started working with the hippopotamus. So this is after I had done all that kind of research sketchbook drawing and started working on making them more into a character rather than a realistic. So I still want you to be able to reference that it's a hippopotamus, but I wanted to have some kind of character, and then back to the raccoons as well. These are like devil cats, fish. Well, I got some new sparkly paint to try out. And if I accidentally slop something, it doesn't make, it becomes part of the whole kind of composition, or it becomes the whole thing. And what's nice about the sketchbooks is that you don't have to worry about making mistakes. You've got complete freedom to go ahead and draw whatever you want to. You can draw a bunch of them. If you don't like them, you can X them out, you can leave them alone. But for the ones that you really like, then you can develop them a little bit further. And a lot of times I'll get some of my ideas for illustrations from just this kind of approach to doodling and trying things out. Okay, so I've done lots and lots of preliminary sketching. And the reason I brought a little friend here is because sometimes you can't make it to the zoo, and they have such well-crafted, really finely articulated animals now that if you can't make it to the zoo, then you can buy some models for yourself, and you can look at them from different angles. You can count how many toes they have and whatnot. So that's always a big help. All right, the next stage that I do, also in my sketchbook, I'll start working on different compositions. And a lot of times, let me get a pad, and we'll say that this is my sketchbook here. A lot of times, I'll put little formats in. So instead of just working on the blank piece of paper, now I want to start kind of working on how I'm going to work with the idea, the concept, whatnot. And so that as I'm drawing something, let's decide, all right, let's have a full view of a hippopotamus. Again, it's just I usually could keep things pretty light. I'm starting to think about, all right, well, what do I want him doing? And I think, well, maybe he could be, or she could be in a pond or the river or something. And
Hey, Franz.
yes.
Our friends are having a little bit trouble seeing. It's almost like too bright. Do you think you can move the camera closer?
Yeah. Actually, I kind of had those cameras on, or those lights on a little bit because they work better for.
That's definitely a little better. If you can move the camera down a little too, that might help.
Well, that's the problem. It's either there or down too low. You can try this. Because we don't need too many more, if we just kind of focus primarily on is that a little better? Or I could try.
Yes, I think that's much better.
Okay, I could try putting a little more light on it. If you want.
I think it's good.
Okay, well, let's go from there. All right.
Actually, you might want to turn that light off. I'm sorry.
Okay, all right, that's fine. We'll keep on going until we get it right. Okay, so I've got this guy here. And then I could start thinking about putting plants or something in the background, kind of frame the character in. Maybe lunch bite here or something like that. So that could be one of them. And then I might think, okay, well, what would happen if maybe be more like kind of reclining and water be coming through here. So yeah, you get the idea that you could do a whole bunch of sketches to see what looks best and start thinking about ideas and how this relates to what you try to get across working with, you know, in this case, the poem. So I do a whole bunch of these until one of them kind of hits me. And in this case, this is the one that I like. And so I was thinking about the situation. You've got a hippopotamus, and I'm observing the hippopotamus. The hippopotamus is observing me. So I thought, well, let's do something where they both, at the very moment where they kind of discover each other. And so it's like, oh, you know, they're both kind of startled by it. Although, if you find a hippopotamus in your own pond, don't go close to it. They're very dangerous. So, but this is, you know, our made-up world, and they're nice and friendly and everything. So I really like the way that these two worked. And so I use that then as the basis for the next idea. So I sketched and worked, and I came up with this then. So this is the composition that I liked. And so I have the main hippopotamus here and a boy, and they looking at each other. I'm trying to get kind of a sense of surprise. And this is approximately the size that I wanted. So instead of it being a square format, I wanted it to be more of a rectangular one. Now this is when, let me sort down and get my tracing paper. Tracing paper to me is such a wonderful material to work with. So I put a piece of tracing paper down. In fact, let me just kind of recreate a little bit of it. So how this can work. Yes.
Some of our friends are asking if they should be following along with you, or you're just showing kind of the process.
Yeah, right now what I'm doing is kind of explaining part of the process, and then I've got a little project that we all can do kind of for the last half of it that you can kind of follow along and start doing it. Although if you feel like sketching something, what I had planned was that we'll take an object and then maybe another object and kind of find some way to get them to relate to each other. And it could be something like, you know, if you have a teacup, coffee cup, something like that. I just picked this up. This is my cat's favorite soft toy, Ratty. He's made it in several of my drawings. But, you know, just anything that's handy, that's nearby, because we can make a story up about anything depending on what your particular vision of it is. So if you want something to do while I'm going through this, you know, take your sketching materials, your sketchbook, and find a couple objects and just start practicing drawing. So what I was going to say is that with the tracing paper, I go over the key elements. Yeah, I won't do the whole thing. And then once I get that done, I can take extra tracings, for instance, of the boy here. And so I can, well, let me get just a little bit more of a, you know, obviously I would do a much better job of being exact, but this will kind of give you a point of reference if we. Okay, so now I'll put that up against a lighter piece. So now, yeah, I've got the hippopotamus. You can imagine it's a little more refined and everything. So I've got the hippopotamus, and I trace the boy. Excuse me. Yeah. And so what I can do is I can say, okay, well, if I put the boy there, is that too close? Should I put him over here? And if I don't have any overlapping, then that flattens out. So I can move the different elements, or maybe I can, another piece here somewhere. Well, it doesn't make a difference. So I think that, yeah, it gives you an idea that you can move these things around now. And then once I got to the point that I liked it, I tape it. And then again, that's where I would get my graphite transfer paper. And let's say that that's all kind of taped together there. Then I simply put it down on top of the paper, and I usually tape it down so it doesn't move. And then I start tracing things. And so with the pressure, you want to put the side that has the carbon, and use a 8B pencil to do this. And if I can locate, I know it's around here someplace, but essentially it's like called a graphite crayon. It's just solid. It looks like a crayon, but it's all graphite. And it's very easy to coat the back of a piece of tracing paper with that. And you can use it over and over again. So all I have to do now is take another pencil and start tracing on top of what I have on the tracing paper and transfer it to a better piece of paper. All right, so I think you get the idea there. So I take this off, then you can see how nicely that transfers. And then this is a kneaded eraser if you're not sure about erasing and stuff. They're made so that they're a little bit sticky. So you do, in fact, do what's its name. You knead it, and so you have it sticky. And then what I do is I press it down on top of that to get all the excess graphite off. Okay. So that way, if I'm using watercolor or something like that, even if I'm going to go over it with the ink, then that kind of minimizes how much graphite is floating around, and that will kind of muddy your colors once you get over it. Okay, so I get that done. Sometimes I'll do, this is just a value study. I use gray shaded markers, and I'll try developing the form and get a sense of which way that I want the light to come with. Sometimes I think about cross hatching. So I do a lot of experimentation on all that. And then just a few more things here. I guess I've got lots of layers. Okay, so anyhow, we've gone from this, and I've gone to a better drawing by transferring it with the tracing paper. And so then I started using my Pitt pens, and I'll put a layer of color down first. And then once that starts to dry a little bit, I can go back with some more Pitt pens. And then when that dries entirely, I'll go back, and I don't know if you can tell with the camera and stuff, but you can see that I then kind of bolster and start shading and start getting detail using my color pencils on top. So I could have also used watercolor. I can use a combination of all of them. You could do it all in pastel. You could do it all in gouache. It's pretty much up to you then to decide what kind of coloration you want to use. And again, this is my style. So this is kind of what I do in terms of black lines. Now you might want to do an illustration that's a little bit more naturalistic. So the process would still be the same in terms of doing sketches and transferring your graphite onto good paper, but then you can decide whether you want softer edges, if you want any line work at all. It's pretty much then tempered toward what your particular style is. Now, I was developing this, and I decided that I actually wanted to turn it more into a painterly thing. So I used this as a color study, and then I finally finished it off. All that preparation work was so that I could do it in gouache. And so this is what the ultimate illustration looked like in gouache. So it was all that process from the very beginning sketch, and then start working with different compositions, and then getting it on the tracing paper, moving things around to get the final drawing. And then in this case, instead of, I retransferred it onto illustration board and then finished it off with gouache. So that's the process. And now I thought what we would do is kind of come up with a little mini project where you could try your hand at the same thing. So if you have your sketchbooks and if you have some drawing paper, tracing paper, let me just clear the decks here for a minute. Okay, so if you don't have an object to work with, I have one that I took off of my shelf, and this is, I don't know if we could, yeah, that might work like that. Let's try that. Okay. We could either see what it looks like from the front camera, and then I could be kind of talking while people are drawing, and they could use this as a model, or we could leave it laying down like that, and I can be doing some sketching and drawing on the pad, whatever seems best. Okay, so what I am going to do, let's maybe leave it the way it is. It's just a real basic form. I mean, when you think about it, it's almost like a ball on the top, ball at the bottom with a couple things sticking out. So I want to choose something that would be, you know, relatively easy to draw in this circumstance. And I would do the same thing. First thing I do is I start sketching. And I've got a version of him on a pad here that I can look at so that you can look at that one. I can look at this one. Yeah. Okay. So it's just a matter of, with a pencil, just kind of block in the main shapes. And so whatever object you've picked, or if you want to kind of do Porky the Pig with me, that would be great too.
Hey, Franz, are you starting on regular paper or tracing paper? Our friends?
Right now I'm working on regular paper. I seem to have misplaced my sketchbook, so rather than using a sketchbook, I'm using a piece of paper. So I mean, yeah, it just shows it doesn't really make any difference. Although sketchbook, I like doing the sketching in the sketchbook because it keeps everything together. I have a tendency to lose pieces of paper like this, but I'm not going to get to the tracing paper quite yet. I'm going to be working out a couple of views of Porky Pig here. I want to kind of get an idea of how Porky is put together. Much the same when I went to the zoo to see how hippopotamuses were put together. And the other thing that's kind of good to do, I mean, I'm glad that we have this light because you can see some of the shading and the shadows. Now, usually when you see Porky, he's in a cartoon. This is a three-dimensional object, and so he's casting a shadow, which could be an important part of it as well. And then you can decide how much detail you want to put in. You know, I'm not necessarily looking to get the exact resemblance of Porky here. I just want some kind of a reference for this type of a shape. He's got a little jacket on. His arms are kind of behind his back. His feet. So in this, I'm keeping it pretty fluid. Now, what I could do, I don't want to disturb it for anybody else, but you know, I could flip him over and look at him from the side. You know, I kind of imagine what that might look like. Just you know, so the idea is to really kind of develop your image, whether it's a flower, whether it's your teacup, whether it's, you know, whatever it is. So you get some kind of a sense of how this thing is put together. And then the more sketches that I come up with, I can be thinking of, okay, well, so, you know, what am I going to do with this thing? And what I had thought I'd do is kind of make him look more kind of like a statue that would be in a park or something like that, and render him so that he might look fairly nice, and then surround him by a bunch of the character pigs that I do that are a little bit more fluid and that are have a little bit more energy. So that would be my idea, but whatever it is that you want to do, you know, kind of figure out whether it's this or the cup or some, you know, set of keys or something like that. Just, you know, sketch each of the objects and see what orientation, what might work. And then once you've done some of those sketches, then also in your sketchbook or on another piece of paper, okay, I'm going to do something that might be a vertical, almost squarish rectangle, and I'm going to think in my mind, I'm thinking that I am going to move him just a little bit there. So I'm thinking about, okay, well, what would happen if I had the statue of Porky here? Standing on a pedestal. Maybe even have some flower plantings or something like that. And again, it's just very sketchy. I'm just having an idea of, okay, I'm going to take this part of space, this is the negative space. And then I thought what I would do is maybe kind of think about some of the pig characters that I do that would be a little less cast in stone, so to speak. So I'm going to try to make him look a little bit more regular, more like kind of a statuesque, and then keep a lot of energy with other pigs that are kind of gazing on his visage in the park. And then, I could think about in the background, having trees and stuff. So this is the type of thing I like doing is, okay, well, that's getting close. So is there a better one that I could do? Maybe he could be bigger. You can also think about, if you're looking up, that would be an interesting shot. So instead of always looking straight on at something, maybe kind of look at it in a way that you're looking up at it, as if you're standing on the ground and this thing is up above you. So, all right. So I've done some sketches. I get some kind of idea how my object is put together. You can think about what object it is that you might be, and you could, most of the times, my stuff is made out of my head. I don't directly reference something except for in that preliminary stage of making drawings. So to kind of speed things on a little bit, I did do a tracing earlier. So I want to get to the next stage here. And so I kind of cleaned the lines up and I made them a little bit more definite, a little cleaner. So that'll be kind of a nice contrast to what I'm going to be doing with my own characters. So I seem to have forgotten my tape. So I hope this doesn't move. So I had one sketch that I liked quite a bit and decided it would be a good drawing to use because it had kind of a clean look to it that I was going after as a contrast to what it is that I want to do. Okay, almost done with this part. The other advantage, if you have this tape down, you can untape one part of it and then you can see if you've missed anything. If you have, you can just kind of drop it back. But we'll just push on here. Okay, I'm not quite sure what I want to do with that because I may have some of my characters around it. So, all right, so now when I take that off, you can see that I got my image in place. I'll move him. Trying to keep him in view in case somebody's still drawing him. Okay, and as I had mentioned, I'll take my kneaded eraser and I want to get rid of as much of that graphite as I can and still be able to use it as a reference point. Okay, so I just kind of have a ghost now. And I think what I'm going to do, instead of just thinking about these borders just going off, I'm going to kind of very lightly sketch in a format. Because as I start working on this, if I know that this is the composition, this is the part of the paper that I want to activate, then as I start grouping other shapes in there, I'm relating to that shape rather than just letting it kind of fall off the edge of the paper. So at this point, I think I'm going to just kind of start drawing pigs. And after I get a couple of these in, I know that we'll be pressed for time soon. Maybe we'll just have one for right now. And then I can think about, now, if I wanted, I could then do some more tracing, figure out where to put everybody. You know, again, if we had all the time in the world, I'd be doing more of that kind of thing. But right now, I just want to get a couple objects in and then start using the materials to give you an idea of how you can use some of those. Okay, so we'll stick with that. And I'll get, these are Pitt Pens. They're very nice. They're bright, colorful. They have a brush point to them, highly pigmented. No joke intended, but I guess that is apt. And then I'm going to take, these are the brush points. Okay, and so that you can either draw very fine lines with them, or if you put a little more pressure, you can get a brush stroke with them. So they're very versatile. Now, as I had mentioned, I like using a real strong black line, and they use watercolor, Pitt pens, color pencils, or something to finish it off. So what I'm going to do is put my black line in. Now, a word about the paper. When you first start off, I understand that you don't want to spend a fortune on paper, but as you progress and as you gain confidence, you want to get nice, sturdy, heavier weight, good grade paper. You know, you're spending all this effort and time, and you don't want to handicap yourself by using paper that's too lightweight. Because once you start working with watercolor, if you're working with colored pencils, if you're using just regular printer paper or something like that, it's not going to work out as well for you. Okay, now
what is your favorite type of paper to use, Franz?
Actually, this paper that I'm using right now is Stonehenge White. It's really good for just about everything. It's a real nice heavyweight paper and it has a little bit of a tooth. So it's smooth enough that my pens will glide over it. And then it has enough of a texture that when I go to start working with the pencil, then it absorbs that very nicely too. Okay, so now with the brush pen, I'm going to use this one to try to get a little variation in the line. So, you know, obvious place to start here is in the pupils. And a lot of times I like getting the line work done first. So now I can go from thick to thin and then a little more pressure. And as it goes from a thin line to a thick line, it helps create an organic roll to that shape. it'll help, you know, kind of give a feeling for shadow too. If I come across like that and then lighten up and maybe even don't put it in there, then I think it just gives the look a little more lively energy. Okay, I got a couple of nostrils there. The other thing, what's kind of nice about having things with the tracing paper, you can redo it if you make a mistake. And a lot of times though that, you know, if I'm working on something and I've made a mistake, like all of a sudden some ink or something blobs on it, a lot of times I'll turn it into a bug or I'll find something else to do with it. So rather than kind of feel like I made a mistake, it's more like the drawing is, we're in collaboration with each other. But if you have the tracing, I mean, I had another book that I did for Leah Kameko. It's called Broadway Banjo Bill. And I was kind of under a little bit of a deadline. And so all the drawings I felt looked really good, except for one of them. I was a little curious about it myself. And I thought, I think it'll work out okay. So I took it to the publisher. My art editor liked just about everything, but then asked me about that drawing and said, do you really think this is your best work? And I said, no, you caught me on this one. And it was the first time that I'd spent hours, getting it to the same completion as an illustration I showed you with the Frankenstein on it. A lot of work, a lot of time in it, but I knew it wasn't my best work and that it would bring down the whole book if I had one really awful drawing. It wasn't that bad, but so I redid it and I learned two really important things: that I didn't have to be perfect, and I figured out how I could correct and rework a drawing, and it just took all the pressure off. And since then, I've just been very, very happy to know that. So don't feel like everything is so precious that you have to worry about making mistakes, because if you're so timid about what you're doing that you don't try something, then the work may not be quite as strong as otherwise. So, all right, so let's, I got this guy, I got that guy. I'm thinking about maybe putting some plants in the background, but for right now, let's keep moving on because we only have about 20 minutes left. Okay, now I can stick with the coloration. It seems like it wouldn't be a bad idea because this could be marble or something like that. And so with the Pitt pens, that come in a wide range of colors, they have one that is a very, very light blue and a very light gray. And so that if I look at the shadows, if I look at the coloration stuff, and I still want to get the sense that that is a white object, I can just maybe start coming through here and using the gray to start putting the shadows in. And again, if you have a light source that you can use to illuminate your object, it gives you a better idea where those shadows are. And it also is going to help you get the form. Shadows can be very revealing. It can really help make things pop out. So. And what I will do, I'll use colored pencil or watercolor or something like that. Now you can use your finger. This formulation, these are really high quality pigments, but they're in the India ink formulation. And most of the times when we think about India ink, we think about black. Well, this is just, imagine instead of using black pigments, we're using all these others. Okay. Now, as I go over them, like it's light gray, and then if I want it a little bit darker, I go over it again, because these are somewhat transparent. These are not opaque. So as you build that color up, And when it's still wet, you can move it around, and you can actually use a brush with water to kind of blend it together, which I do. I'll show you an example of it, maybe with a brighter color. But if you hit that and you're working on paper like Stonehenge that has sizing in it, then you can kind of turn it into watercolor. Problem with it is that with our time constraint, you know, it takes a while for that to dry, because if you go back on top of that with colored pencil, it's going to ruin the surface of the paper. So I want to avoid blending these together. Okay, so if I want darker shadows, I just go to another pen, slightly darker gray. Okay, so it's starting to come out. If I want to, I can jump over, and I guess that's more of a red. I don't necessarily have to keep the same color palette as, you know, I could have made that green, I guess. But I think in this case, I will, you know, kind of show you how you can use that. I have that nice, intense kind of reddish pink color. And then if I thin it out, like with a watercolor, I can move it around and come back and pick it up, put it over here. Got pink little nostrils. Okay. And this I might kind of keep more full blast. Now, when I was doing the illustrations for the book, it didn't take quite a week for each of the illustrations, but, you know, I took my time, really developed it. So with the time we have here, I'm going a little less meticulously, but that can be okay in itself too. Give you a different energy to it. Come back, put a little more kind of dark color up there. Okay, so I could continue doing that. Well, let's go ahead and give him his yellow bow tie here, and then I'll work back to him. All right, now I have colored pencils. And one of the things that really works well, if you're doing a multimedia project with these Pitt pens and with the Goldfaber, you know, the Faber-Castell pencils, they have what's called color indexing, so that whatever number this is like a number, I don't know if I have a 104. Well, I've got a 105. That's close, but assuming that both would be 104, the pigment that is in this pencil is the same pigment that is in the pen. So if I'm working pencil on top of the Pitt marker on the Pitt pen, then if I choose the same color, then I can make sure that they're going to match up. Okay, so if I want to work maybe some shadows in there, I have a slightly darker pencil where I can get some of the shading. I can get kind of more volume in there, or I could switch over and let's just do big here. I wanted to show you as many effects as I could. So this is working with the Pitt pen. And I started to talk about the tips of them. I used the number S, which was for super fine. We have the brush tip and the fixed pen, which would be number S. They have a thicker one, which is a fine, and F, M for medium, and the brush, of course. Okay, so That just occurred to me. I've never tried this, but let's see. That seems to be working just
someone asking about the colors again. So just to kind of reiterate, so all of the products within Faber-Castell are part of a color naming system where you can Pitt Artist pen that's, let's say, color 120, and you have a Goldfaber pencil, color 120. They're going to be the same exact color. So when you're when you're doing a mixed media project, you can use the different mediums and get the same exact color. So we have that with our soft pastels, our oil pastels, pretty much every product that we offer.
Yeah, and it makes it so much easier. I mean, I like combining the Pitt pens with the pencils. And so knowing that I could be doing a mixed media project and not have to worry about matching the colors, it's very nice. Okay, so I just did a little, I've done an experiment with putting pencil down first and then using the Pitt pen on top. And normally I would reverse that, but as I said, it takes a little bit of time for the Pitt pen to dry completely. So if you go over it when it is still wet, you may scar the paper or it's not going to stick. But I found that the Pitt pen seems to work nicely on top of the pencil. So that might be the way to do it. So let's get a shadow in there. Let's see if it will work with kind of a nice shadow. With that, yeah, that seems to work very nicely. I think part of it is that the pencil has a tendency to stay on the top of the grain, and then when you put the Pitt pen down, it goes all the way to the bottom. So that's working pretty good too. All right, maybe we'll just kind of finish up some more of this. Let's do the pedestal here with the pencil, and then very quickly, I want to start kind of developing part of the background. Again, do some drawing, maybe on another piece of paper or on tracing paper directly. And when you can move it around, you can decide how you like it. Put your graphite paper down, trace it out. Okay, let's do it in this blue. Okay, I've got a variety of greens here, so if I can start kind of putting a feeling of bushes and stuff back here. When I go quiet, that's an indication I have thoroughly entered my world that I'm creating here.
Friends, we would love to see what you're creating. If you show your pictures up on your camera, then Franz can look back and see.
Okay, which ones are we talking about? Sorry.
Oh no, I'm just asking everyone who's participating to show their pictures.
Yeah, let's see what we've got.
Very nice. I see photos. Very cool.
Yeah, I think you're on your way.
Yeah.
And when you actually have, something definitely in mind, you use this technique where you develop the image. I like the idea of trying to, even though I have it kind of planned out, they're still in the process of the finished piece. I still like there to be a possibility that something unexpected could be developed. Okay, so here, we'll just call this a nice walk in the park. Or maybe a walk in the park. Yeah, so I think that with this method, you can plan things out and still have a lot of fun. You can keep things a little bit more spontaneous. You can get things so that they're a little bit more exact. You know, it's going to depend on the effect that you want to create. And so, like anything else in art, what's really important is what it says to you. You know, you don't have to make your pieces look anything like anybody else's. You could be using the same materials, the same type of techniques, but in your particular use of it, it may be such a strong reflection of you that it's no question that it's yours and nobody else's. So it's a very, very nice way to kind of get totally lost and you can make your own little world. Does anybody have any last questions or any concerns? I'll keep on getting lost here in my park.
No more questions, but if anyone has any additional questions, just type them in and we can ask Franz. Everyone's really enjoying the class, Franz.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, I think that, I mean, a couple of times, you know, when I've gone silent, it's just, I forget. I mean, I'm just totally lost. All of a sudden, it's like, there I am. You can also, I mean, you know, as long as, I guess since we're using Porky Pig, it isn't quite a dog and pony show. But we've used the colored pencils and we've used the Pitt pens, which when they dry, they are permanent. But while they're still a little bit fresh, then they're going to be a little more susceptible to water and stuff. But again, with that kind of index color type thing, let's maybe get a completely different effect with watercolor in the sky here. So yeah, it's just really a lot of fun to create. I think too that, you know, in a case like this, it is nice to incorporate a little bit of watercolor because it acts as a nice base, and then you can come back with the Pitt pens for some texture if I want to make that look a little more like kind of stubbly grass. Like a little dirt path, I'll get that next. I'm gonna get a kind of a darker shadow. Stuff going on there. Once I have this finished, then it's like, okay, well, do I like it? Do I not? Does it make any difference? Okay, so those areas have dried with the Pitt pen, so I can come back and work with pencil. You can really build this up. You can layer quite a bit and become very rich. Yeah, so I can. There we go. Oh, I was holding off. My favorite things to do is put the pupils in. No. Okay, well,
Hey, Franz, we have a
that's
question.
fun. Yes, yes.
What's your favorite type of tracing paper?
You know, actually, a lot of times I got a vellum. Canson makes a really nice heavy-duty vellum that, especially for the wherever my carbon sheet is. Yeah, this sheet here is yeah, this is regular tracing paper. Most times it works great. In fact, sometimes when it's thinner, it's better because if you build up lots of layers, you can see through it. But for this carrying sheet for the graphite, this is actually a piece of vellum that's a little bit heavier. And I find after I've used it a couple of times, if I take my crayon again and go back over it, it does a nice job. I'm still looking for wanted to show you what the crayon looked like, but it has disappeared. So yeah, in that case, just about, and the other thing too is that you don't have to get the sheets. You can also get it on a roll. And so that is very helpful sometimes, because on the drawings that I showed you for the book illustration, it was much longer. It was much wider than a single sheet. So instead of trying to buy a huge pad, if I had, it's like a 2-foot long roll, and you just roll it out. So it's a transitory thing. It doesn't have to last forever. It just has to be strong enough to do. And as I said, that sometimes if it's really thin, then you can get a better idea of what's going on, especially if you put if we decide, well, let's see what happens if we put the hippopotamus on top of that, and then on and on. After a while, it gets to be a little bit more difficult to see through. So for this type of thing, I think just any thin tracing paper, whether it's a roll or sheets, will work. But for if you're going to make your carbon transfer paper, then graphite transfer paper, then if you get a pad of the vellum works okay too. It's just, like I said, it's a little less clear because it's a little bit thicker.
Great, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or?
No, and I want to remind all of our friends that the video of the recording will be available on michaels.com and on their YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch and learn some techniques again, it'll be there. And we're really grateful for you all to be a part of the class. And thank you, Franz.
Okay, you're welcome. I hope that you all go off and have lots of fun doing illustration.
Awesome.